The Rare Slot Podcast is part of the Booster Pack Network. For more TCG-related content, visit theboosterpacknetwork.com. Hosting for this show is sponsored by Category 1 Games, the go-to shop for all of your classic TCG needs. Find your favorites or discover something new at category1games.com.
Hello and welcome to Rare Slot. My name is Rands and this is the show on the Booster Pack Network where we can have casual conversations that are just anything related to trading card games. These could be topics that maybe I want to talk about. It could be something that you guys, the listeners, have suggested. So if there's something you want to hear about on the Rare Slot, let us know via our YouTube comments or shoot us an email, which can be found in the description of this episode. Or it could just be something happening in the trading card game space around us. Now, this is an odd and special episode because, much like our previous episode, we're celebrating Magic the Gathering's 30th year with a run of episodes in the Rare Slot that focus a little bit more on Magic than we normally do on this show. And today we're focusing on mistakes. Now, these aren't the kind of mistakes that frustrate the fans of Magic the Gatherings, like the ones we're discussing constantly online, that Wizards of the Coast choices that they're making, those kinds of mistakes. I'll leave those to be discussed elsewhere. These are the kind of mistakes that actually excite players and collectors. These are the kind of mistakes that Wizards of the Coast quality assurance doesn't want you to know about because they are misprinted and oddity cards. These are cards that shouldn't exist. They're cards that have found their way into the hands of players in some sort of irregular fashion, and they shouldn't exist at all. They're the cards that just are not the quality product that Wizards of the Coast wanted to put out. Now, these are kind of mistakes mostly that are getting made in manufacturing, so they can exist in any trading card game. So this isn't just exclusive to Magic. And what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the different kinds of misprint cards you can find out there in the world. Perhaps they're test print cards, perhaps there's something that's been cut incorrectly. But what we do have is somebody who's going to walk us through all of those different types of cards and some of the most interesting cards in Magic's misprinting world. Now, that guest is somebody who knows a lot about Magic and a lot about misprints. And in fact, they are somebody who literally wrote the book on Magic the Gathering history. So they know a vast amount about all things Magic the Gathering. But they are an author, they are a historian of Magic the Gathering, and they are a collector of some of Magic's wildest, weirdest, and rarest relics. Please join me in welcoming to the Rare Slot. It is Ryan W. Rooks. Ryan, how do you do, bud?
Very well, thank you. And yourself?
I am not doing too bad at all. Before we jump in, let me give a little disclaimer to the listeners. Now, this is a bit of a show and tell episode, so if you are just listening to the audio, we're going to do our best to explain what we're looking at here, but this could be one of those episodes that you want to check out on YouTube specifically, because there is going to be some gems we're going to take a look at. So you'll find that link to the description if you're listening to just the audio-only version of the podcast, but go check it out if this content is something that is interesting you. Now, let's throw it back to you, Ryan. I am so excited to talk to you. As we turn the mics on, we just had a huge long conversation. We're both big nerds for gaming history and especially trading card game history. But what I want to know is a little bit before we get into the era cards and stuff like that. I want to know your history, specifically as it relates to Magic the Gathering and trading card games. How did you get into Magic, as it were?
Oh, well, it's a wonderful, heartbreaking story. I was introduced to Magic in late 1993 by a friend of my older brother, who said, oh, check out this new game. And we liked fantasy and we liked games. And so we started playing and enjoying it. And this friend warned us, now they've announced that there's a new revised edition coming out where they're going to have a better card mix and they're going to fix all of the problems with the set. So make sure you don't buy any cards until the new revised set comes out. That's the one that you want where everything is fixed. And so I resisted. I didn't buy any of that beta, any of that Arabian Nights, any of that Unlimited. I waited and checked my LGS every day until revised came out. And that was the day that I bought my first cards. And I was just hooked. Ever since, I've been a collector of everything that there is to do with Magic.
So what kind of things is that? Like obviously, everybody who's into Magic the Gathering can say that they have a card collection of sorts. But tell me about, some of the more interesting, non-sort of card-related things, because you are a bit of a collector of, like you said, everything for Magic the Gathering. You're even, for those who are watching the video might be able to see, but you're wearing a actual Wizards of the Coast quality assurance t-shirt right now. So anything to do with Magic the Gathering you've collected. So outside of cards, just specifically, just to digress a little, What are some of the odder things that you might have in your collection?
Oh, goodness. So the things that I specialize in are anything to do with production because I absolutely love it. So I collect play test cards and test prints and factory scrap and everything to do with that. I also have a large number of accessories. I have a really nice collection of Magic the Gathering chocolate bars and snowboards and badges. And I have licensed Magic the Gathering pencils and shot glasses, and I try to collect one of everything so that I can tell the complete story of Magic. I also am into localized things. For example, products that are in languages that sets aren't produced in. For example, I have quite a few Dutch products and Slovenian products and Czech products and Polish products and things like that. Also, all of the book localizations. I mean, really, the answer is everything.
Wow, so you're a one-man magic museum, basically. I hope one day people can explore your treasures in some form. Now, talking about collecting and talking about sort of the weirder side of things, let's jump into the cards themselves, because that is obviously Magic's bread and butter. Tell me, and we're going to go through them, we're going to talk about the misprint cards, some of the test print cards, some of the oddities that you actually have, but how did you first start getting involved with this sort of oddities and obscurities community and error cards and stuff like that? How did you first start bringing those things into your life?
It started with serendipity, like it did with so many of us. You know, you look at that card from Revised. If you don't know, it was printed with the wrong frame. So it's a blue card with the frame of a green card, and I thought that was really cool. And then shortly after Fallen Empires came out, a friend of mine was cracking packs of Fallen Empires, and he opened up a Tidal Influence that was missing a bunch of ink. So the blue mana symbol was missing half of the ink. And he looked at it and said, oh man, my card is messed up. What trash? You know, because back then collectible playing cards were a new thing. Collectible cards before that had meant things like baseball cards where any kind of factory error is generally devalued. And he literally folded the card up and threw it in the trash. And I said, wow, that's really amazing. I love the way that looks. And I dug it out of the trash. And then he said, oh, well, if you want it, you're going to have to trade for it. So I did. And that was the beginning of my factory misprint. So those two, one of them, my first standard misprint, meaning that every copy is misprinted. And the other one was my first factory misprint, which meant that something went wrong at the factory. And I was just enamored with them. You know, there wasn't a community back then. There were people on Usenet, but it was small. No one was into misprints. But there were a couple of us around who, you know, just collected them, you know, in secret until Keith was good enough to start standing up a real community a number of years ago.
So just for those who are listening, Keith is basically a really prominent figure in the sort of misprint community, is probably, you know, the go-to guy for all information as far as misprints go. I believe he was once called, you know, Magic Misprint Guy on YouTube. He did some early YouTube videos.
He's the misprint guy. Yeah, and he did a great job of bringing a lot of this information to the masses to begin with, and was the founder of the first misprint group on Facebook, which now boasts somewhere, I don't know, over 60,000 members.
Well, with more cards and more products coming out, there's always more opportunity for there to be errors and issues and stuff like that. You know, we recently saw a lot of that coming out of the Jumpstart set that was a little bit back, because obviously, you know, that became a new way that they were printing, and it caused some issues. And that's just one example. But we're talking about printing, and I'm sure nobody is going to doubt from what you've just told us your bona fides when it comes to Magic the Gathering. But you're also a bit of a scholar of cardboard. You know, you've shared with me that you own, you know, cardboard that dates back to, you know, the 1600s in some capacity. You know, early playing cards and various sort of odd things. And you're also a little bit of somebody who is very much into the world of, you know, press printing, especially when it comes to sort of trading cards in general. Tell us a little bit about what that is, and just a little bit of your history as far as, you know, the actual official manufacturing and stuff goes, your pressman journey, if you will.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I got deep into misprints, and, you know, something that I would do just out of curiosity was try to figure out how these errors happened. And I came up with these theories, and I would talk to people. And the problem was I really didn't understand what I was seeing, and I didn't understand the terminology from the people that I was talking to who did understand what they were seeing. And taking this very seriously, if I was going to be serious in the misprints, I actually went through a pressman's training course, and I got the textbooks, and I went through the tests, and I spent about 2 years going through the same training that someone would do if they wanted to work in a printing facility. and I became a subject matter expert in offset lithography, which was the kind of printing that they used for early Magic cards. And so, full disclosure, I have never worked on an offset printing press. I have worked for a print center. I own a digital press, which I've done a run of cards on myself. However, I have gone through all of this training, and I regularly talk to people in the industry in their language, and I generally know what I'm talking about when it comes to printing. I'm kind of a print nerd now.
Well, it sounds like you're certainly going to be the perfect person to speak to today about these sort of factory misprints, these sort of unusual cards that have sort of come out of the printing press in a way that was unexpected. So let's jump into that, because it's very exciting. I mean, it's never been something that I've really collected myself. I've certainly seen my fair share of them over my years, but it's never been something that really, I gravitated towards, just because they are such oddities, and there are so many, collectors like you who are so rabid about them. They are a little inaccessible generally, but sometimes, like you said, you can just open it up in a booster pack, and it could be, like any other Magic card, just a awesomely rare card that you've just stumbled across. So you've brought with you today a handful of cards that we're going to talk about and sort of unpack not only what that card is, but why it became a misprint, how it could possibly happen. And between your Magic history knowledge and your knowledge of pressman sort of work, I'm sure we're going to learn a ton. So what is your first card you've brought to show us today as far as a misprint goes?
Now, I have these laid out in the order that they actually happen during production. I've given this talk many times. It usually runs about 2 hours, so we're going to speed run it here. I feel confident, though. So, type of error is something that we already mentioned, which is standard errors, things like the serendipity freight. And I think that people are generally familiar with those, and it's not something that I need to show. But the next type of error is also something that actually happens before printing, and those are stock errors. So stock might have something when it's actually being made where there's extra objects inside of it, or it might not bond completely with the blue layer in the middle, and so you might get a split stock error. Sometimes there will be markings on the stock, such as splices, or they use tape for a large number of things during the manufacturing process. And if they leave that on there, there might be a piece of tape that gets printed over. And I can show examples of any of these if they tickle you in particular. But the one that I thought to highlight is this one, which is a cockroach that was on the press and got printed over.
So for those listening, what he's holding up is a card that is a printed Magic card, but there has been a literal cockroach squished into the stock of the card itself. And now when we use the word stock, we're talking about the cardboard that the cards are printed on. And it's absolutely fantastic. Those watching on YouTube will be able to see it, but it is the literal entrails of a bug, slimed across a card. Yeah, take it from there.
Exactly. So this happened before printing, and we can tell because there's layers of print and the press coat, which are on top of him. And also the printing is disturbed on the other side because of the thickness while the front was being printed. The back is printed on the cards before the front is. And so you can tell that this guy was on the cardstock before the back was printed, somehow stayed on there after the front was printed and through the cutting and collation process to make it into a pack.
That's amazing. Good thing that printing factories don't have to worry about a health inspector.
Indeed. So that is an idea of stock errors. The next type of error, if you're ready to move on, is going to be what's called pre-press or pre-flight. So these are often, you'll hear them called make-readies, although that's a little bit of a misnomer. When you're getting a press ready to run, an offset press, there's a whole bunch of things that you have to do to get it ready. You have to set these things called ink keys to adjust how much ink is going to come down each lane. You have to get the water circulating. You have to change the blankets and change the printing plates and a whole bunch of other very dry and boring things I would love to talk to at length. But long story short, once all of that is set up, they press a button that actually says make ready on it, and the printer starts up in like an idle mode. Think of your car idling, where it's going very slowly, but it's moving forward because the press has to be moving while it's turned on for everything to be flowing. Now, when you first start it up, not everything is flowing yet. And you need to make all your checks and adjustments, make that things are aligned, make sure the ink is where you want it to be. And while that's happening, you have to feed paper through because the ink that's moving has to go somewhere or it's going to gum up the press. And so they run scrap sheets through. And during this make ready process, you're going to run through, on a good day, 3,000 to 5,000 sheets that are all scrap. And on a bad day, jumpstart, on a bad day, you're going to run through a lot more sheets. maybe as many as 10,000 sheets. And now the printers with Wizards of the Coast, they're not reimbursed for those sheets. So they have to pay for the paper, and they don't make that money back. So one thing that they'll do is they will use the same sheets multiple times, especially at the beginning of Make Ready when they know that the sheets aren't going to come out right. So these sheets come through, and they'll just feed the same sheets over and over again and put layer of ink on layer of ink because they know it's not good, but paper has to be moving through the press. And then towards the end, they'll start to run clean sheets, and then after that's done, they'll actually dig through the scrap pile and look for anything that's good enough and throw it in the good sheet pile so that they will get paid for those sheets. Now, there's a lot of errors that happen during the Make Ready process. Like I said, there's double prints. There's things that are going to be out of alignment, too much ink, not enough ink because the press was still getting up and running. And so those are called Make Ready errors. And a lot of really gross errors come out of this. And so people have associated the word Make Ready with severe error, but it's actually not fair because, like I said, a lot of good sheets or very minor errors also go through the Make Ready process. And you have Make Readies in your collection that are indistinguishable from regular cards. But that's the long-winded version of what's going on with that. And so here's an example of a Make Ready card. So here is an unlimited Brain Geyser, and it's also an unlimited forest upside down, and unlimited forest is printed on top of an Antiquities Jalum tome.
So what Ryan is showing here is he's showing the front side of a Brain Geyser from Unlimited and then turned it over, and rather than having a traditional Magic card back, as we heard, that this particular sheet has obviously been fed through a couple of times on the face, making sure everything goes through properly, but we're seeing a double printed side. It's absolutely wild. Now, this particular one you're showing me has almost a silvery border. Now, is that just from the overprinting of it, or is there a particular reason for that?
Yes. So the reason is that the first printing was white bordered, and the press coat, which is the varnish that goes on as the last step over top of the ink, went on top. And so the second printing that went over top of that wasn't able to adhere to the card as well. And so the black ink for the second strike didn't adhere well to the borders. It's actually very difficult to get the borders as black as they need to be for a printing, and they have to run the ink very dense and sometimes use multiple layers and things like that. And so it has a tendency to come out light like this, where it ended up as gray on this card. If you look at it under magnification, it's actually very blotchy, and you can see that it's not gray ink. It's a very poor strike of black over white.
So here's another question in regards to that one. That one, I assume, wasn't found in a booster pack because people who are only listening won't be able to see, but people who are watching will have seen it. It has squared corners.
Yes, and most cards, not all cards, but most cards that have squared corners have come direct from WotC. A practice that they used to use back in the day was to use sheets as buffering material. And so they would take these scrap sheets that they would normally throw away, and instead, well, they need a whole bunch of packing paper for the pallets that they're mailing out to the distributors. So they take these scrap sheets and wrap them around the pallet to act as a buffering. So if anything, knocks into it, it's not going to harm the product. And then, those sheets are thrown away at the destination. Well, some of those sheets were recovered by people who recognized what they were and thought that they looked neat. Some other sheets were collected through QC and were saved instead of thrown away for some reason and made their way into the hands of collectors. This particular sheet, I'm not 100% sure. I know that there's a very similar sheet that is suspected to be buffering material. This one may have been the same, or it may have come from a former employee. I'm not sure.
So the interesting thing there as well is we've seen this in recent years with Magic the Gathering, and I didn't personally receive one, but I definitely saw there was some secret layers or some sort of product that, I think it was a secret layer product, where we saw this sort of buffering used in actual, official, and I'm using quotation marks there, but official Wizards of the Coast packaging, rather than those sheets getting thrown out and just being wasted and using some, pure virgin paper. They were recycling these sort of discarded sheets. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, so that's part of actually a different initiative where Wizards of the Coast made a pledge to have all of their packaging completely recyclable at a certain time, either recyclable or made from recycled material. And this is why they started experimenting with things like the cardboard booster packs, which were much maligned, and other little things that they've been doing. And that was an experiment in that. They said, hey, we have a large number of scrap sheets, and we need a semi-rigid card protector to protect these cards. what if we use these sheets we already have sitting around and recycle them for this other use instead of just shredding them and sending them to the dump with all of our unsold product? And so that was something that they decided to do, which I thought it was really cool because number one, it's scrap material, so there's a higher chance that you're going to find wacky misprints inside of these. And also, it's helping to save the planet, and kudos for that.
Absolutely, especially considering we just learned how much waste goes on with card printing, how much stuff we have to sort of churn through before we can actually get, the pristine finished product that we normally have.
The Magic cards are absolutely not recyclable nor edible, unfortunately.
I would hope that you've only tried one of those two things.
Yes, that's true. I have not tried recycling them.
Absolutely. Now, if anybody is interested why Magic cards aren't recyclable, I'll point you to another Rare Slot episode where I speak to a game designer who is making Andrew Navarro. You can find it on the channel. If you search his name on YouTube, you'll probably find our interview. And he speaks to why trading card game cards are not recyclable. And it has a lot to do with all of the elements that go onto it. We mentioned varnish before. That's an element of it as well. Now, let's jump back. What is the next misprint you've brought to show us today?
Yes. So the next one I have to show is insufficient ink. So when you're printing, the main types of actual ink errors that you can get, if you think about it, is not enough ink, too much ink, or the correct amount of ink but in the wrong place. So first off, I have one that is insufficient ink. This is what we call an albino.
Right. So what you're showing me right now is essentially a Magic card that almost looks like it's been not quite grayscaled, but definitely it's completely washed out. It looks like, Wizard of Oz before Dorothy gets to Oz.
Yes. So it's ostensibly a red card. But what's happened with a type of error like this is that there was a problem on the press. How albino errors usually happen. And if they're having trouble figuring out where the issue is, or if the issue just lies within one of the units, they can actually turn off a single printing unit. Now, it doesn't shut it off, it just removes the pressure. So there's the impression roller that's pressing against the press blanket at a point that's called the nip, which is the point of pressure where the ink is transferred from the blanket to the card. And when they disable it, it just undoes that pressure. So it's still running, sheets are still going through, it's just not transferring the ink because there's no pressure there while they work on that unit and look at the cards and figure out what's wrong with the press. And so in this case, they have disabled, it looks like it's only black and white, but this does actually have cyan. It's just a card that doesn't have much cyan on it to begin with. And so we call this variety a blue bino, albino plus blue. And so that's how those happen. And you can get a very similar effect by leaving cards out in the sun, to get, UV faded.
So let me just, I certainly know what you're referring to, but just for those who might not be too familiar with, the way printing is done, you sort of mentioned cyan there. Unpack why that's a significant thing in printing, specifically Magic cards, this 4-color printing.
Okay, so it's one of the primary colors. Basically, with cyan, magenta, and yellow and black, you can mix any color under the rainbow except for white, but the paper is white, so that's your white. In theory, you can actually mix cyan, magenta, and yellow in equal amounts and get black, but that creates CMY black, which is ugly and muddy, so we also add black ink. Most Magic cards are actually a 5-color process because they have 2 strikes of black. Some of them actually run as many as 9 color units for all the different effects and things that they do, possibly more these days. But the answer is so that you can mix all of those colors together to get any color of the rainbow. And they do this in a particular way called half-tone, where they take each of the colors and they take the image and separate it into each of those color values, and then align all of the dots on a grid at a specific angle, and they adjust the size of each of those dots to adjust how much color is in that space on the card. And then by combining where the dots are in what's called rosettes, you can produce, all of these fantastic, very detailed cards.
Yeah, so if somebody looks at a very, very close up at a Magic card, you will see that it's not a flat printed image, there is these little, almost looking like Venn diagrams, these circles that overlap to create a color. And if people have like a home printer that uses not just a single black and color cartridge, but has that black and then those three independent colors as well, the three primary colors, that's basically doing the exact same process at a very small scale, obviously.
Yes, and there are some exceptions. There's extra, like for example, when we do what's called the text black layer, that's not assembled from dots. That's a solid layer. So it's not assembled from halftone. It's the solid text, and that's often also used for the borders and things like that. Sometimes they'll use other colors for accents. For example, the silver for the old cards, they would use silver ink instead of trying to mix black and white, because you can get a purer, more attractive looking metallic color with metallic silver ink was the correct way to do that. And also there have been specific printings that used other processes. Originally, Magic cards were all halftone at 150 LPI, but some like the alternate fourth, the United States Playing Card Corporation, did what's called stochastic printing, where instead of laying everything out on a grid, all of the dots are semi-randomly placed. And instead of making the dots bigger or smaller to accent a color, they pack the dots closer together where there's more of that color and spread them further out where there's less of that color. So there are very notable examples. I don't want anyone looking at a card and saying, well, this isn't what he described, this must be fake.
Well, I mean, I don't think when listeners, you guys clicked on this episode, you thought you were going to be learning so much minutia about the printing process, but it is absolutely valuable to know, because as an end user of these things, you think they just are, no pun intended, but magicked into existence. So let's move on to the next one. So we've gone from albino. What's our next sort of step in the printing process that may lead to an error?
All right, so here is a card, and you'll notice there's extra black ink on the bottom of this card where there should not be black ink.
So yeah, it looks like somebody spilt soy sauce on it.
Right, because the error on this card wasn't even on the card front, it was on the card back.
Wow. So what Ryan's holding up now is essentially it's a forest card, and on the front of it, it looks like a splatter of extra black ink, which as I said before, it looks like soy sauce or something like that. But he's turned the card over, and what we're seeing is the top half of the card is a traditional Magic back, but the entire back side of it, from about halfway down the card, has turned to black. Has just been completely printed as smudged black. It looks like it's almost fading away.
Oh, yes. And see, there was so much ink that was laid down on the back that it actually disrupted the other layers of ink on top of it and did what's called set off to the next sheet in front of it, which was where it transferred from the other sheet to the front of this card. And so, in printing terminology, we would say that, the black unit of this printer took an absolute shit on this sheet.
It looks like they have a poor diet, if that's what their feces looks like, but it's certainly a fascinating one indeed. So do we have another? So that's for that one. So this is essentially just a spilt ink on a card that has sort of spread out. Now, what's sort of the next part of that process as far as we see another error after that ink spill?
So the next one would be what is a contact error. So here's a card where everything was printed correctly. Now, when the cards are printed, there's a press coat that goes over the top, and those are light sensitive. So they'll go into an infrared oven that instantly sets the press coat on the top of the card. Now, it's still going to be a little bit gummy, and the ink underneath isn't completely set yet. So when the sheets come out of the back end of the printer, there's a little puff of this offset powder that creates a microscopic air gap between the sheets. And that's just so that all of the elements on them can finish curing and drying without the cards touching one another, because you can get what's called set off, which is where ink comes off of one sheet onto another one, or worse yet, scuffing, which is where a card rubs against something while it's still wet, and then it smears everything together, which is what happened with this card.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what Ryan's showing up now is we have an artifact creature card that is it has a text box, but along the text box, it looks like somebody is almost taken a pencil eraser and tried to rub out the rules text, because it literally has its rules text ink smeared across the rest of the card in a horizontal fashion.
Yeah, so this is an example of something where all of the ink was correctly laid down, but then we have a contact error, where something touched this card and then just moved all of that ink where it's not supposed to be.
Interesting. So, just speaking specifically to that, when a card is coming off the printing press, does it need sorry, not even a card, but a card sheet, like an uncut sheet of cards? Does it need some sort of amount of time to dry, as if you were painting a wall?
It does need a little bit of time, but it gets that while they're finishing the print run and waiting to go to finishing. Finishing is the part of the process after printing. Some printers do their own finishing, and some actually ship the palletized sheets to other finishing facilities for collation, for cutting and collation and packaging.
Okay, fascinating indeed. All right, so that's a smear now, or a contact, we should say. That's a contact that looks like the ink has been literally smeared across. Tell me, just a little question that's popped into my mind. In the instances of the ones we've spoken about so far, were you to open one of these cards in a singular booster pack, or even furthermore, a booster box, is it likely that there'll be more of that same error within that same cluster of cards?
So it depends on the error type, but you always want to err on the side of buy the rest of the case.
Interesting. So there's a tip for everybody. If you open one booster pack with an error card in it, maybe go and rummage for the rest.
Yeah, because, for example, something like the cockroach card, you wouldn't expect a swarm of cockroaches to be in a box. But this card, I have a high 3-digit standing offer on. And so it might be worth your time to check just in case. Whereas things like this albino card is a 4-figure card, and there's a high likelihood that there will be others in the same box or nearby.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to qualify that because, I've seen people sort of almost, and we might get to this particular error sometimes, but, piece together what looks like how it would have sat on a sheet. So what is the next error you've brought to show us?
So one thing that I would like to mention is that some of actually the most common errors are things that don't show up well on camera. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to describe them because you really need to get up close. And there are things where the cards just look off, and people describe them as blurry or fuzzy or double printed. And they're not actually double printed, but they do look a little bit blurry, but not in a way that shows up well on camera. And usually that's because there's a problem with the ink and water mixture on the press, or there might be a little bit of what we call blanket burn, where the press blanket has slipped or moved or gotten a wrong impression, or something has gone wrong in a minor way. And so you're getting ink that, for example, although those half-tone dots are supposed to be perfect circles, but if they're not, if they're a splatter or if they're an oval, we call that slurring. And so that'll give it an off look. Or you might have an issue where there's ink showing up where there's not supposed to be ink on it. For example, if ink makes its way into the fountain solution, and so it's coming up on the parts of the plate that aren't supposed to have ink. Or if the plate is losing its ability to hold ink properly, then you'll get ink outside of the areas that there's supposed to be ink, and that's called scumming. And those are very common kinds of errors that you might find. I suppose the third one, which is a little bit different, would be misregistration. Registration describes how each layer of print aligns to the other ones. And if any of those layers are off, then the card will just look wrong and fuzzy, and people will often describe them as double printed. But what's actually happening is that 1 or 2 layers of the print are just a fraction of a millimeter offset from the other layers in a way that's difficult to show on camera, but it's something that is easy to see with the eye, and that you're likely to come across in your Magic career if you crack a lot of packs.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of makes it, gives it a little bit of a blurring look, I would assume, as far as that sort of goes. But we can't show it right now. But yeah. So as I was saying, what is the next card you've brought with to show us today?
So the next one that I'm going to show is a stamping error. After the sheets have come out, they go to finishing, and one step of that is going to be, stamping, and that would be like date stamps, which are like a blank foil. It would be the hollow foil stamps for the rare cards, anything like that that's stamped on. And I should note that there's a lot of things that look like stamps that are actually printed onto the cards these days. For example, when they recently did the personalized cards, where each LGS, had the name of the LGS on the prize cards, that was actually printed onto the card on a digital press a digital lithographic process, that's not a stamping process. However, like the hollow foil stamps and things like that are done with what's called a hot press stamper. So you take the entire sheet and you have these rolls of stamping material.
Basically, the material that if you pull from a Magic the Gathering pack, one of their rare cards, you'll see in the bottom, on the very bottom of the card, there's that oval sort of, hollow seal that, you might see on a constant ticket or, in other sort of security measure type things. So you've just shown me some pure of that. And what we're talking about right now is sometimes that stamp specifically will be misaligned. It'll be on the reverse side of the card. And also things like if you've ever gone to an earlier pre-release when they used to stamp the dates on the cards for the pre-release specifically, that kind of thing is what we're talking about. So I'll get you to go on.
Exactly. And to be perfectly clear, with what I'm saying, each of these types of errors, there's at least a dozen different varieties of each type that I'm showing. I'm just giving the broadest strokes because of time restraints. And so the card that I've selected to show for a stamping error is where we have a partial stamp on the Planeswalker symbol of this card, and it's not crude in the slightest.
The reason, so this is interesting. All right, so let's unpack this. So what Ryan's showing us right now is it's a blue card from Throne of Eldraine by the looks of it, and it's got the Planeswalker symbol assumingly stamped on it. Now, for those who really know their history, the icon of Magic, the sort of the logo that is Magic nowadays is that Planeswalker symbol, which has the 5 points representing the colors that come into a single one, and that started as a hand symbol. So it being originally a hand, what he is showing us right now is a hand that is missing, and if you imagine the 2 fingers on the left and the 2 fingers on the right. So essentially, we're getting flipped off by a Magic card right now.
Exactly. And this is one of several different kinds of errors. See, this is one that'll happen sometimes because with the hot press stamper, you have to fight between if the temperature on the stamping machine is too high, then you bond too much material to the card. And if it's too low, then you don't bond some of the finer elements, such as those thin fingers on the Planeswalker symbol. And so that's what's happened here. It has only bonded the material from that single finger, if you will, of that symbol. But like I said, there's many different types. There's the sheet might be fed upside down, so the stamp is upside down, or the stamp is on the back of the card. The stamper might have too much pressure, and so it actually punches the stamp into the card, and you can see the stamp from the back of the card. It might be too light, and so not all of the material gets put down, and there's no impression. There might be where it's stamped on the material 2 places in the same way. And a common way that you might see that is what we call the crescent moon stamps for the rares, where because it's an oval stamp, and when you have an oval that's occluded from part of the oval stamp, it leaves a little crescent-shaped sliver left behind in the material. That's quite a common error to happen since they started using these stamps. So that would be another example. And there's just loads and loads of hundreds of different types of Magic errors, just to reiterate.
So that stamping thing is amazing. And I think what people might not realize as well is that's a different process. Like, you probably don't think about it as a consumer, but at the same time, the foil stamp that is at the bottom of those rares or the stamp that's on those pre-release cards, as I mentioned before, that's a different type of foiling to the actual foiling process itself. So when, let me just ask you about this, just because of your experience with pressing and printing and stuff like that. Let's use this time to digress just a little bit and explain how a card gets foiled, because I'm not sure if people know, but you're not actually printing ink on top of a card or cardboard or stock, as we called it, that is already foiled. Is that correct? How does a card become a foil card?
So they've used quite a few different methods of foiling cards over the years. The original process, which is quite similar to the process that they use now, is they take the regular Magic stocks, and they also purchase these sheets of foiling material, and then they have this foil material applied to the stock over top it, either by the sheet or by the roll. And early on, they were sourcing these small sheets of foiling that you needed multiple sheets of foil per, print sheet. And so there would be these splice lines that would run across the foil. And this is quite a common thing to see in old foils, is why I bring it up, where there will be a horizontal line in the foiling that we call a foil cut line, which is where the 2 pieces of foiling are joined together. And they still do something like that to this day, like I said, where they're going to take the print sheet and just have a thin sheet of this foily plastic material that is professionally applied over the top of it. Now, there are some more recent cards where they actually use a printed on treatment, like with what we call the cold foiling process. You can actually acetone that off. That is printed onto the cards, and that's how they get the texture.
Interesting. That's that is a really fascinating way to sort of look and differentiate the way that foil cards are. Now I didn't want to digress too much, so let's jump back in. What's the next error card you've brought to show us, and the next part of that sort of printing process?
So the next one that I brought has to do with cutting errors. So miscuts, when they cut cards from the sheets, there's a few different ways that they do it. The original way is that first they would cut the cards, the sheets, into rows and then columns, which would leave you with these individual cards with square corners. And then they had this giant card-shaped cookie cutter pneumatic press. And you stack a couple thousand cards on it, and then there's a pneumatic press that just shoves it through the cookie cutter and lops off all of the corners. And then they put them into packs. Things that they've done later on would be where they actually have a more traditional die press where there's card-shaped holes, and they can punch a whole sheet at a time. Some of the Japanese cards are cut where they cut one side of all the cards and then they cut the other side of all of the cards. So like left side of the cards and then the right side of the cards. And there's a tremendous number of different ways to cut them, which in the industry is called slitting. You're slitting the sheet apart, and it might be a 3-step process where you separate into rows, then columns, and then do cornering, or it might be a 1-step process where you just punch the card right out of the sheet in one piece, and it could be anything in between. And there's a number of things that can go wrong with it. If the sheet is cocked or is moved to one side, then you're going to get a miscut. And if it's severe enough, it might show a second card. Usually in the misprint community, if you're not showing a second card, we call it off-center. If you're showing a second card, it's called a miscut. And then there's a million different varieties of these things. I should note that there's cards where one side of the card, like for example, the front, will be miscut and show 2 different cards, but the back will be centered. That's not actually a cutting error. That's a printing issue where the sheet was fed incorrectly. And then, when it was cut, one side of the printing was offset for whatever reason. But the card that I've selected to show what a miscut can be is one that we actually call a twisted miscut. So this card was a card where they cut them into rows, and that was correct, and then they cut it into columns. But when they cut the strip into columns, it was just a little bit cocked, and so it came out being trapezoidal. And then when it went to have its corners cut, well, the card is trapezoidal, and so 2 of the opposing diagonal corners end up as squared, and then the other 2 opposing corners are 2 rounded. And so all of the corners end up with these various deformations from the process.
So what we're looking at, Ryan, is showing us is it's a hooded assassin card, and essentially, if we're looking at it, it looks like basically it's like a hooded assassin card that's slightly tilted, but then you're seeing another part of the card that was next to it on the sheet by itself, and then also again, as Ryan was just saying, the corners are a little bit off just because of this sheet has shifted during that die cutting or, cutting process regardless.
Yes, and in fact, if I put this guy into a KMC Perfect Fit, he pokes out the bottom. It is not card-shaped and is taller than a standard card. Also wider at some parts and narrower at some parts, so that's quite a bit of fun.
These things are absolutely fascinating, and just, like I said, we're so used to opening packs upon packs and just seeing cards as pristine and perfect as they are, but obviously opening these sort of things is amazing, and it sort of reminds us, as I said before, it's not a magical process. This is a physical process that they need to go through, and one of the most charming things I think about physical collectible card games, digital collectible card games and stuff being what they are, these are real interesting artifacts. So with that, let's jump onto the next part of the process and the next error you might end up finding in your booster packs.
So this one, I realize now I actually sleeved them out of order. So this is going to be touching back on a previous one, which is the varnish. or more appropriately called the press coat. Not all press coats are varnishes, but we colloquially speak of them as such.
So that's what you're talking about right now. It's like when you feel a Magic card, it doesn't feel like a piece of cardboard or paper because it has a finish on it that makes it feel smooth so that it can be shuffled easy. Playing cards have this as well. I believe it might be part plastic or some sort of coating that is actually on the cards itself. So what we're looking at here is it looks like it doesn't have any. What is this one, Ryan?
So I'm trying to catch the magic angle in the light that will show that half of the card is missing the varnish entirely, and the other half, so one half will look gloss and the other half will have matte. The purpose of the press coat is to seal the ink, but it also helps to protect the card. It has UV protection, it gives it moisture protection, and it's just a little bit harder than the stock itself, so it prevents against dents and dings and stuff. And it's also a matte, which is a little bit glossier than the printed stock itself.
Yeah, so what's Ryan's holding up in this example is it's a land card that is essentially, as he's holding it to the light, you can see there's almost like a dividing line down, sort of like a diagonal stripe of it, and some of the card is reflecting light, as if it was, a glossy card, and then the other one is just pure cardboard. You're not getting that sort of you're getting an actual sort of like as if you were to feel a greeting card or something like that, rather than a Magic or a playing card.
Yes, and again, to be clear, this is something that would have happened before cutting and would have happened before stamping, because this clear coat is actually a part of the printing process. It's one of the units at the end, and the press coat gets laid on a blanket, on a roller, the same as any of the other layers. And so it's actually one of the last steps of the printing process and should have belonged there in my presentation. I apologize.
There's no problem there, but let's move on to, forward or back, whichever way we're going with this one. The next card that you wanted to show off, because these are absolutely fascinating.
So the next one that I'm going to show is the very last step, which is going to be packaging. Now, when you're packaging cards, there's some rather uninteresting errors that are quite common that people don't even think of. Like, you find a card in a booster that's backwards or upside down, and you say, oh, that's funny. Or you find, oh, this booster has 2 rares in it. But another step during that would be during collation, which is where you randomize the cards and mix them all up so they're not in a predictable order in the packs, and then you put them through the packaging. Now, most cards come in boosters, which goes through what's called a flow wrap process, where there's a plastic material, the booster material, which gets folded around the card. And contrary to popular understanding, there's no glue sealing the packs shut, at least with most Magic cards. It's a heat seal process where the material is heat sensitive, and a crimping jaw comes down and mashes the card in crimping jaws very tightly, and it's very hot, and it seals the plastic to itself. And then a blade comes down and cuts it, separating the packs apart, and it just runs through. Now, something that can happen as it's running through, if a card is slightly off kilter when it's running through the flow wrap machine, is the card will get caught in the jaws, and then you get a crimp. And crimps, let me see, again, I have to hit the magic light angle.
So what Ryan's showing this time is it's a card, this particular card has got almost like if you've, if you take a bag of chips or if you take a booster pack more specifically, you're going to see, along the edges of that booster pack are going to be like sort of little divots. If you look at the logo of this particular, this show in itself, you will see that I represent those divots and stuff, and that is the heat sealing coming down. But this one has actually hit the card itself and made an impression. So it looks like there is an imprint on the card in these little sort of almost piano key-like divots on this particular card. And this one has multiple, which is something very rare, I think.
If the card is far enough off, because the machine crimps the top of one booster and the bottom of the next one at the same time because it's more efficient. And then a blade comes down and cuts them apart. So if a card is too far off, then it will catch both of those crimping jaws simultaneously, and we call that a double print. There's another error where, because the back of the pack, has that flap, which is also crimped in a separate process, that's called the spine of the pack, and so a card can get a spine crimp as well. And this card was lucky enough, this is the only triple crimp that I know of in existence, where it has been caught by both of the regular crimping jaws as well as the spine crimper. So this has 3 separate crimps, and you can see where the cutting blade came through here, but failed to cut through the card because it's designed to cut through thin booster plastic and not cardboard.
And if you're listening to this, it does almost like, just to paint a visual picture, Ryan is holding up the back of the card, and you can clearly see it almost looks like tire marks have driven over the card from like a Hot Wheels car or something like that. It does look like it's just been like skidded over or something like that by some ostentatious teenage driver. Like, it is actually a really interesting way to look at the card, and it's I believe a pretty common error you will find, and it is something that is definitely distinct and stands out in the misprint community for sure. Now, is that particular type of error, that's the very end of the process? There isn't any other errors that can happen? I mean, I guess once a card's in a booster pack, it's in there.
Well, I mean, we recently saw another error where the distributor sent the wrong boxes to someone. I suppose that technically happens after this, but that's probably not what you're asking about.
No, certainly not.
Yeah, so this would be the end of this presentation. Although this is just, to be clear, the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, certainly the tip of the iceberg. And honestly, like, we'll talk about it towards the end of the episode, but there is a great resource that people can go on to help identify not just Magic cards, but card printing errors in general. We'll talk about that later. But what we do want to talk about nowadays, those are the, and again, for those not watching, errors in printing. But there's also other oddities. You know, there's other things that are bizarre about, Magic cards. Things that, or even any trading card game, things that weren't meant to get out into public hands. And you have a handful, no pun intended, handful of those as well. Do you want to start talking to me about some of the oddity stuff that you have as well that is related to Magic the Gathering in sort of card form?
I would love to. So I would like to start with playtest cards. So this is called a Gamma playtest card. This is the third round of pre-alpha playtesting.
So what Ryan's holding up right now is almost, you think of it almost like a business card size. It's certainly not a normal Magic card size, but what it is it's almost just essentially a home printed piece of cardboard. If anybody has ever looked into the history of their favorite trading card game, there is usually a ton of these images available, where this is what game designers use to make sure, to prove to themselves and prove to, people who are manufacturing the card that the game works in a sense. So what Ryan's holding up now is a copy of Armor, which is a red enchant creature card that, does some amazing stuff. One of the unique things about Magic's playtest cards, especially the earliest ones, they have amazing little clip art. Again, if you're only listening to this episode, you're really missing out seeing such a unique and fascinating relic. So tell us a little bit about the playtest cards in general, and even the journey that, in specific to Magic, the way that they've decided to use playtest cards over the years.
Originally, this was the game. So Magic cards hadn't been printed yet. This is what Richard Garfield and his friends and Peter Adkison and all the workers were using to playtest Magic. This wasn't the first round. The first round was the yellow pre-alpha alpha cards that Richard Garfield used. And then they had pre-alpha beta cards, which look like this. And some of them have art, but most of them don't. And they're all different colors.
So what Ryan's holding up now is a Elemental Blast card that is the red one that cancels blue spells. And what it is essentially just a piece of, card stock that you could kind of get at any Staples or anything like that, just with words printed on it. The unique thing is, obviously they used a black and white printer, because the way that the mana symbol is done is there's an empty circle, and then there is a felt marker been colored in. Tell me a little bit about what you can tell me about that type of beta playtest card, which, just for those people who are listening, or may not be aware, the original Magic the Gathering playtest set, there was 3 to sort of 4 of them. Beta is not referring to beta as in the released card set of beta. It's referring to the way that the released the playtest cards in amongst the playtesting group, which included people in Seattle, which included people in Philadelphia, and it was how Richard sort of proved the concept of Magic the Gathering before it became an actual product that people could buy.
And Vancouver.
Absolutely, and Vancouver, my previous hometown, that old Robin Harding. Yes, there was a couple people in Vancouver as well.
Yeah, and just to touch on a few misconceptions about these things. Number one is that people look at them and say, oh, well, that's printed on regular paper with a black and white printer. I could make those. How do you know that they're real? And of course, the answer to that is provenance. But really, the card stock that was used to make these is a particular early 1990s Kinko's using, now 30 plus year old printing technology. These are not easy to reproduce, and people have tried, just to throw that out there. When you're a printing nerd, you will realize, and this is a problem with even modern counterfeits, it's a lot harder to match something that looks and feels right than you would suppose. And another thing to touch upon, so most of the betas didn't have artwork, but some of the later ones did. And the casting cards were represented differently back then. So here's a sea serpent, and you'll notice that the casting cost is 4 and a blue. So today you would say that's 5 mana, that's a blue and 4 colorless. But the way that mana costs were read back then, this costs 4 mana and one of those has to be blue. So today this would be represented by 1 blue and 3 colorless, is the way to think about this. And you'll notice there's only one number for power and toughness because they only had one number that represented both the power and toughness. And it wasn't until a little bit later on that they decided it'd be more interesting to have creatures with different powers and toughnesses, which they started also doing during beta playtesting. And you can see that on the beta, the colored mana was represented by a dot that they colored in with a marker, whereas by the time that Gamma had come around, they're using the familiar Wooburgs.
Which, for people who don't know, Wooburg is basically the 5 colors of magic. White, blue, black, red, and green.
And to be precise, in the early days, they used Boogaroo because they hadn't developed Wooburg yet, so it was just alphabetic order by color, black, blue, green, red, white, instead of white, blue, black, red, green. Another thing about this particular Gamma test card, and the reason I selected it, is that it has this infamous unicorn stamp on the back, which marks it as one of the pre-alpha playtest league cards.
So I believe that was for draft purposes or something like that, so people couldn't mix in other cards. So what Ryan just showed us was there is almost like think of it like like an actual, physical hand stamp on it that is that looks like a unicorn. So that can be identified as sort of like when they started to develop the idea of way back when early play or league play, cards that were specifically in a small pool, this is how they identified them.
That's exactly right. Now, I believe you said that it's okay to be a little bit crass on your show. I believe I may have already been inappropriate at least once, because it's time to talk about filler cards.
And I'm so fucking excited to talk about this filler card.
So I'm going to start talking about that filler card by talking about this filler card. So when you're laying out cards onto sheets, the number of cards that you want to print and the number of card slots on the sheet isn't always evenly divisible, which means that there's extra slots on the print sheet and there's nothing to put there. And so with modern cards, they look a lot of different ways, and one of those would be something like this. This is what we call the Chiller Pillar filler, because it's a filler card and the border around it is that of a Chiller Pillar art card. And it has a barcode here that says drop 3, which is a signal to the electronic QC system to drop this card collation.
What Ryan's holding up right now is essentially what is acting as a blank magic card with a very specific barcode that tells the printing press to, when it reads that barcode, to just remove those cards from packs.
And thank goodness it fails in doing that at times. And I love this copy because someone literally folded it in half and threw it in the trash. And I'm, 25 years later, I'm still pulling $100 misprints out of the trash at modern LGSs. So they had this problem all the way back into pre-alpha playtesting. And so sometimes they wouldn't collate them out and you would get a blank card in your pack. And that felt bad. And so, because you were shorted one of the cards that you should have gotten. And so people started doing pranks with these. Like they might swap out their ante card with one of these blank cards to fuck their opponents. And so some clever soul had the idea of going to the master sheets and writing on them this rather crass message to, number one, let people know when they opened one in a booster that they didn't get all of their cards because they had in fact been fucked. And furthermore, if I slip this into my ante, so even if you win the match, this is what you get, Now I have fucked you in return.
So what Ryan's holding up now is I'll get you to hold it up some more, Ryan. It is absolutely a fascinating card. So essentially what we just talked about with filler cards, this is the playtest version of that, especially early on when we're talking about early 20-something college students, who are either undergrad or, post-grad, and they've got a card here that is supposed to be blank, but instead it says, "You have been fucked." And with an exclamation point. It's absolutely fantastic. I love the fact that there is that attitude, that sort of, that sort of punk attitude of early Magic design that, you just don't get anywhere else. A lot of early Magic playtesters, have been self-described goths. A lot of people who worked at Wizards of the Coast at the time, and it is just so speaks to that sort of attitude, that sort of real grunge rock, it's Seattle in the 90s, that real grunge rock aesthetic. I highly recommend people try and look that up.
Quite a few high-profile employees were literally the board members of the Camarilla Vampire the Masquerade local club up there in Seattle.
The most astute listeners right now might be able to go back and find one of those members in my previous episodes, and I still play poker with him every Friday. But go on.
And so I have 3 pre-alpha playtest fillers that are all different, and 2 of them say fuck, but I'm going to show you the third now because it's the most historically significant, would be this mosquitoes. So there was a playtester who got sick getting fucked, and so he went to Richard Garfield's master sheet and drew what would be a useful card for his deck. So instead of getting a blank card, he would get something that he could personally use that would now be, printed on each of the sheets with blank cards. And it actually ended up being a useful card, and mosquitoes ended up being printed as Will-O-the-Wisp in Alpha.
So what Ryan was holding up there is another playtest card. Again, it would basically, think about it as business card stock, or business card sort of cardboard. And it had a picture of a mosquito drawn on it called Mosquito. I think it was a 0/1. It flies, it regenerates, it costs, I think, 2 and a green, or 2 green, 2 mana, one of which has to be green, I believe, in that particular example.
And I mean, and then they carried forward with what we call these small stock playtest cards until Arabian Nights. And so here's another one. A lot of them have jokes. A lot of them have things on them. So this is Power Sync, and you'll see it's a picture of a powerful sink on the card.
So yeah, there was a lot of sense of humor with these sort of playtest cards as well. And what we were looking at a second ago was it is a Power Sync card, which is a famous card from, the earliest days of Magic, and there is actually a picture of a sink on it. Another one is Heal, that is Heal is I can't remember what the actual card ended up becoming, but basically, heals life. And it had a picture of, I believe, Scaphalias is one of the early playtesters' foot on the card, representing the heel of his foot.
And then once Arabian Nights came around, they moved to what we call the large stock playtest cards. Here's an example of that from the Dark, being a Grave Robbers. And you can see that during playtesting, originally the ability was return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand for 2 black. And they decided that was a bit powerful, so it should also tap. So you can only, recur artifacts infinitely once per turn.
Grossly overpowered. So the interesting thing about that, though, is it is a card. It's from this one in particular is from the Dark, and it's slightly larger. It is more comparable in size to a traditional Magic card than the previous ones we've looked at.
Yeah, it's about the same rough size. Although these were all hand cut with scissors. So your mileage may vary.
Yeah, of course. And that's so fascinating. So these are some of the more weirder oddities of sort of early Magic, and there's so much history involved in the way that the game evolved and what was going on behind the scenes that, again, as an end consumer, maybe even like yourself who was sitting there in 1993 eagerly awaiting, Revised, you never would have thought that this is how these things evolved. And I absolutely love these artifacts. Now, is there any other these oddity era cards, whether it's playtest cards, or perhaps even something else that we haven't seen before? Maybe things like, obviously there's always proof of concept, so there's always a thing called test printing. So where they want to create something, but they don't know how it's going to look, so they print off a couple just to make it look, get an idea of how it's going to look once it's in a player's hand. So do you have something like that?
Well, I have quite a few. Yeah, yes. May I show one more playtest card?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry to jump ahead.
Just to show the process. Here's another large stock from Mirage. And what I'm going to show now, what's the name of the card? I don't know. What's the cost of the card? I don't know. Power and toughness? I don't know. But it's a summon legend.
Oh, fascinating. So what Ryan's holding up now, for those of you just listening, again, it's sort of a printed, sort of almost in that same business card, but again, that larger size, like more traditional Magic card size. It's got question marks all around it, but obviously they had landed on some sort of effect, and they wanted to sort of test that effect in the game holistically.
So I'll breeze through to some play test cards, or excuse me, test print cards now. So for example, here is an example of when they almost disastrously switched frames to this style of frame.
All right. Well, I mean, if you're only listening, again, I'm sorry to sort of taunt you, but this is one of the most beautiful things in all of Magic history. Essentially, what we're looking at here is a card that obviously, I mean, I think when they were messing around in that sort of early 2000s era and they changed to sort of what's called the modern border nowadays, they had sort of experimented with a couple of different versions. And what we're looking at now is a version where basically the artist name and the mana cost runs along the side of the card instead of having the artist name at the bottom and the mana cost at the top. And it's rather compelling. Now, this one is got the mana cost on the right side, and more traditionally, you know, a lot of games have it on the left side. And what Ryan has decided to just hold up is the other version of it. Same card, but with the actual mana cost on the left side. So that, I guess the thinking there was if you were to fan your cards in a traditional manner, you would be able to see your mana cost immediately with the cards. And I personally think they're quite beautiful. What's your opinion on those particular test print cards?
To be clear, I also like it. They were not popular when they were shown to most people, which is why I said almost disastrously. And there's some problems with it. For example, some people thought that the aspect ratio of the artwork might be a little bit better. However, it makes the art box and the rules box both significantly smaller, which is a problem both for art and for design. And so it's probably historically that they did not move that frame.
That's it's one of my favorite little oddities in all of sort of Magic the Gathering sort of test print history. And it's really fascinating to see these experiments. You know, so you're seeing the inner workings of how they're crafting and changing the game. You know, in this particular case, when they're doing the 8th edition change, when they're going from, you know, what was, you know, the original frame that, I mean, a lot of people are familiar with if they've ever seen like a Black Lotus or the Moxes or anything like that, to what we sort of have nowadays, that sort of modern sort of, or we sort of have a postmodern frame nowadays, but that modern frame that sort of is more streamlined and slick, it's really fascinating to see part of this process that they've sort of gone through. Now, what other sort of test prints exist out there, or at least that you've encountered?
Oh, there's a tremendous number out there. People don't even realize because so many of them are so rare. There's numerous test prints where, you know, fewer than 10 are known to exist. I'll run through a handful that are more historically significant. Here's one from Exodus, and you might recall that Exodus did not have foil cards. They were testing the foiling process. This is actually a textured foil. So it has that camouflage pattern that they used later on. Also in the foiling over here, it has a +1, which signifies the density of the ink, because they had to experiment with different volumes and densities of ink to go down on the card to make it look proper.
So what Ryan's holding up now is, first of all, it's a card with a completely white back, but at the same time, it's a foiled card. And if I can't really tell, Ryan, but can you confirm that the art box is unfoiled?
So it's not that it's unfoiled, it's that it has what we call the white underprint layer, where they have a super dense layer of white ink. Because, you know, like I said, normally you get the white from the color of the stock, but foil cards are printed on metallic silver sheets. And so to get white on those cards, you actually have to print white ink onto the card. And so they use a really dense white ink. And that's also how they block out different sections of the artwork to make them less foiled. So in this case, they've made it entirely not foiled by printing under the other layers of ink with a very dense white.
And it's so interesting, for those who are familiar with early Magic foils, this one is a lot more sparkly. It has a lot more sort of a light capturing on it and sort of accents that they don't really have. And you said that was from Exodus, and foiling didn't really come around, if I'm not mistaken, until the mid Urza's block. So Urza's Legacy, I think.
Here's what one looks like with no printing on it from the same sheet.
That's amazing. That's very psychedelic. It's basically just an unpictured card, but it's a foiled card that's been cut. The back of it is white, and ultimately what it is, it looks like, something out of like a 1990s sort of, surfers board or something like that.
And so everything that they do or consider doing, they have to test extensively to see if it's good, is it better, is it worse, and how are we going to do it from a technical standpoint. And so if you think about it, every time that there's been a change to the frame, every time there's been a new printing process, every time there's been a new type of foil, or even things that they've considered doing, like the unglued 2 scratcher cards, they had to test that out. So there's so many different types of test prints. Here's one from when they were trying out the M15 stock.
Right, so this is from when they took that change back in 2014. Basically, you've got a new border, you've got a new end, and what we've got here is a Planeswalker card that is foiled, but has no text, it has no image, but also has a whole bunch of, I think it's a black frame with blue mana symbols. I can't really tell, but it's actually a really fascinating look.
It's green with blue mana symbols, yeah.
A green one, sorry, yeah, it's a green one just because of the foiling I can't tell, but it is actually a really fascinating look at sort of this production process, because not only do they need to print those, but they need to send them to Wizards of the Coast to approve. And it makes me think how often they must be getting test print cards nowadays, now that they're doing new treatments, they're doing all this collector booster stuff. It really is fascinating.
And so here's one that recently showed up in Jumpstart. Jumpstart had a tremendous number of misprints and errors and other things because they accidentally released a palette of scrap in a story that's much too long to share right now. But that's how we got the void cards.
So what we're looking at now is for those who have played Jumpstart, there's sort of a header card at the start of every booster pack to tell you what you've opened, and what we're seeing here is a card stamped with the word void, which would normally be reserved for a filler card, but here we see it on something that's gotten to public hands.
Yes, and this is a test print that was not intended to be released as far as we know. And so the next few things that I would like to show are even further afield into off the deep end of oddities, so to speak. So the first would be a production sample. So back when they were previewing Ice Age, they were putting it into a bunch of different magazines. And so they also have to test all the packaging for things. And so this was produced as a product sample from the company that made these little plastic wrappers to actually staple the cards into the magazines. And they have to test all of their booster boxes, all of their tuck boxes. I have quite a few examples of things like this, but
yeah, like I said, these little rarities and oddities are just so interesting.
Here's a card, which is what we call a semi-official, where it's not an official card, but it was made either by a Wizards of the Coast employee or with permission from Wizards of the Coast. There's many, many different varieties of those. This is a camp card where Wizards of the Coast actually ran a summer camp from the WotC headquarters, I believe for 3 or 4 years. And they would design cards with the kids and then make the cards that the kids designed into these mock-ups and send them home with a copy. So, there's a handful of these that went home each year from the summer camp.
So what Ryan's showing us right now is a card called Skystone, and it's a sort of a Magic the Gathering sort of layout style sticker stuck on top of another card. And so that during those sort of Wizards of the Coast summer camps that I believe ran from 97 to 1999, maybe 2000, they would, like I said, people like Mark Rosewater and stuff would go and show the kids Magic the Gathering and teach them how to play, and then towards the end they would obviously, as Ryan said, have them make their own sets and then give them sort of these semi-official playtest cards. And essentially we've seen a bunch of these sort of interesting sort of semi-official cards that have been Wizards of the Coast employees who've created cards over the years that are basically, for lack of a better term, custom cards, like we would make at home.
Yeah, I mean, there's the miniature cards. There's a guy, Donald Vaccarino, who was one of their rules guys, who did some private events where they let him make his own cards. There was one of their distributors who'd had their own event series, and they had permission to produce their own cards. So there's rather a lot of varieties of what we call these semi-officials.
Ryan, what we'll do is we do have a little bit less time than I would have loved, but let's bring this let's bring this in. Is there any other major interesting points that you really want to show off before this episode sort of wraps up?
If I can do last three rapid fire.
Let's do it.
Here's press approval. So here is from one of the QC sheets where the Wizards employee is actually like doing press approval on it. I don't know if this will turn out, but they're actually making notes on the back of the sheet about the color quality and what they need to do during printing. And it has this press approval sticker on it to show that it's been through the process.
So the interesting thing there is it's a cut of two cards together next to each other, and that would have been sent to somebody who was quality assurance or quality control at Wizards of the Coast just to sign off on the fact that, hey, this looks like what we're looking for.
And then there's things like factory scrap. So this was found through dumpster diving, and this is it's textless. So this sheet was, failed to see for various reasons, and so it got scrapped and ended up in a landfill somewhere, and some lucky dumpster diver pulled it out.
That's amazing. This is a really interesting. What Ryan is showing right now is a number of cards strung together on a cut sheet that don't have any text on them whatsoever, except for the titles. And it's really, really fascinating to see. Like, you just will never see that anywhere else.
And the last one would be unreleased cards. So sometimes they'll go through the whole process and produce a set and then not release it for some reason. This most famously happened with Alternate Fourth and Summer Magic. And people who are kind of deep into Magic the Gathering will know about those. So the one that I selected to show is Russian New Capenna. They did not release Russian New Capenna. They had already announced that they were going to stop releasing Russian cards. And then there was some kind of conflict, and they opted to stop early with New Capenna. And they were never released anywhere in the world. Somehow 2 boxes leaked out. And so I was able to secure a number of these cards that officially do not exist.
This is an absolute beauty. So again, I think you'll probably have an idea from the way Ryan just explained it, but what we're looking at is a Russian card for a set that never existed. And actually, it's a beautiful and perfect card. I'm very, very envious of that one in particular. Again, obviously, we know what happened geopolitically when New Capenna was about to arrive, but it's absolutely fascinating to see something like that as not just a piece of Magic history, but sort of something that is a knock-on effect from global history affecting a game we love.
Indeed. And I suppose that's the end of my spiel for now. The last thing that I'll say, is in spite of all of these errors, there's a lot of negative talk about Wizards QC at the moment. And they're actually doing a pretty good job in the printing. In any kind of manufacturing, you want an error rate, below, a certain amount. Let's say it's, 1 per 200 units is allowed to have some type of error. When you're printing 10 million of something, and people say, oh, I've seen 100 errors out of 10 million cards, they're actually doing an amazing job. I am not speaking about Pringling, just about the sorts of errors that I've shown. And if you want to be very harsh, just remember I ate the QC guy and stole his shirt. So you can blame me.
It's fantastic, and I love the education and the interesting points of oddities and errors that you've shared with us today. I mean, I know this is only... to tip of the iceberg would be an understatement for I know the extent of your collection, but I'm so glad that you're able to educate me and the audience a little bit on how the printing process works, why we find these error cards. It's absolutely fascinating to see some of these sort of, more tangible sides of production. Again, to say it for a third time, magical is the way it feels when you open a pack of Magic cards, because it's just, it's just there. But there is so much that goes into it. I really have to say that I appreciate all of this time, Ryan. It's been an absolute pleasure to not only hear about, some of the elements of the way you got into Magic, not only some of the ways that Magic is actually printed, something we don't think about on this user end, and also just see parts of your collection and hear some of the history behind the physical making of a game that, sort of lives in our imagination for the most part. You know, when you're swinging a crawl worm at a dredge skeleton, it's all happening in your imagination, but this is something that's tangible. It's something that's real, and it's what brings this together in this particular game. I want to say thank you. Obviously, if you guys are listening and you want to learn more about this, I cannot recommend a couple of links in the description. I will link some of Magic's most prominent sort of misprint sort of websites and groups. Take a look at that. As well, I'm also going to link Ryan's first book. As I mentioned during the introduction, and we didn't even talk about it, Ryan wrote a book about Magic the Gathering, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it covers, you know, basically the first 3 or 4 years of Magic the Gathering's sort of history and a bit of a timeline as well. But Ryan, tell us about what you're working on right now.
So I'm working on volume 2. Volume 1 of my book was written greater than 10 years ago. I have spent literally every day since then working proactively in some way towards this new volume. It's going to contain everything that the first one did, the entire history of Magic up through the current. It's going to talk about misprints and test prints and Magic lore and all kinds of things that you'll find interesting if you're a very dry Magic nerd like myself. This volume in its current version of editing is over 1,000 pages at 8.5 by 11 10-point font. So hopefully there will be something in there for everyone.
I cannot say how excited I am to get my hands on that. Years ago, I bought your original book, and I loved it, and it helped me, you know, for those people who might not know, it helped me, fall in love with Magic history, and then that spurred me on to create the Twitter account that I ran for a couple of years and stuff like that was all about specifically Magic history. But for those of you who are listening and you want to check out Ryan's original publication, I will link that in the description as well. It's an absolutely a fantastic tome to have. Even with another one coming down the pipeline, this is a great one to have on your shelf as well, especially if you are to borrow Ryan's phrasing, a dry Magic nerd like the two of us, or TCG nerd as well, because any of those any of those cards or any of those misprints could happen in any game. And again, I will ask you, if you've got interesting misprint cards that you've pulled from any game of a TCG, let me know. Let me know in the comments, send me an email. I love to hear about this sort of stuff, and this has been a real pleasure for me. So before we get out of here, is there any final thoughts you want to add there, Ryan?
I'm just passionate for Magic history. It's the biggest tabletop game in the history of the world, and it's a shame that more of this history isn't being recorded. And so I want to say thanks to you in particular for helping to spread the history of this new form of gaming. I think that that's something that it deserves to have happen. So I deeply appreciate that. And if you ever want to get deep into the dredges of the lore and see a bunch of oddities and things, you know, in another episode, or even just privately, let me know, and I am there for it.
Oh, I am so there. Like, I'm pretty sure once this camera turns off, we're not going to finish talking immediately. But yeah, ultimately, if there's anything you can think of that Ryan might be able to speak to, by all means, let me know, and we can bring him back for another rare slot. You guys are allowed to suggest topics as well, and anything that may have been touched on here that you find interesting, or anything you want to know about Magic history, I'm sure between the two of us, we would be able to find you an answer, whether it's official or on the record or whatnot. I would love to be able to share that with you guys, the listeners. Now, before we get out of here, a couple of things I want to add. Obviously, again, thank you so much, Ryan. I could not be more grateful. But at the same time as well, if you guys are interested in the history, not just of Magic, but of collectible card games in general, let me recommend you go check out our sponsor, Category 1 Games. They stock pretty much all of the classic collectible card games throughout history. There's over 200 games listed on there. Not so much Magic, but all of the other stuff as well. Heck, you might even find era cards on their website. Go check them out. As well, I will mention, if you're into the more contemporary stuff, the modern stuff, go check out another one of our sponsors, Toad and Troll. You can actually get a discount by using our discount code TBPN5. It'll be linked in the description in case you've messed it up when I said it, but you can go get a discount from them using that. Now, that's on anything that they're selling proprietary, anything that they're selling direct from Troll and Toad, you will be able to get a discount. So again, you'll find details about that in the description. I cannot appreciate you guys listening to this episode. There was some crunchy and fascinating information for big old card nerds like myself and Ryan here. So before we get out of here, I want to say goodbye from me. Goodbye from you, Ryan.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure, and I hope you guys agree. That's it from us. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Rare Slot. Remember, check it out, and I promise Ryan will be back at some point in the future for another episode that may be just as crunchy, but just as enjoyable. At least for me. I hope you guys enjoy it as well. All right, that's it for me. Until next time, remember, keep shuffling.